Well, since the fall of the Assad regime, many Syrians have been returning to their homeland from long exiles abroad. But after more than a decade of civil war, many are returning to find their homes or even entire city blocks unrecognizable.
Weeks after rebel forces toppled Bashar al-Assad and ended 24 years of brutal repression, a celebratory mood still prevails in Syria.
My message to the people listening to me abroad, especially my brothers, is to come back. The country has become good, and the freedom we have been waiting for has finally arrived.
Approximately 6 million Syrians fled the country during the civil war, half of them to Turkey. The UN says thousands have already returned, and that another million are expected to follow in the next 6 months. Allah and his brother spent the past 7 years as refugees in Turkey. When Assad fled, they returned to build a new life in their old home. But their neighborhood is an unrecognizable wasteland.
We came here searching amid the piles of rubble. Which is our house? Which is our alley? There is nothing visible. In each house, we were digging a little to find the tiles of the house, until we finally discovered that this is our house. I do not know by then if I was happy to have located the house amid the rubble, or upset because the house did not exist.
Nearly 90,000 people lived in the Kabun suburb of Damascus before the war. Then, in 2017, government troops began a furious campaign of shelling and airstrikes to drive out rebel forces here, wiping whole neighborhoods off the map. But Allah isn't fazed.
We will use the experience that we gained in Turkey here. We will not depend on foreign companies. We waited for a week after the government fell to return our keys to the landlord and come back.
Syria faces a long and costly reconstruction. The UN estimates it will take $400 billion to rebuild. But for the first time in decades, the uncertainty is tinged with optimism.
I'd like to bring in Giorgio Cafiero, a Middle East analyst and CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics in Washington, D.C. Welcome. We've seen just now Syrian refugees returning to their home country, even as large parts of it lie in ruins and to a country that is still saddled with sanctions. Is it too soon to be going back?
Thank you. Good to be on your program. You know, millions of Syrians were forced to leave their country during the ugly periods of the Syrian crisis. And I think it's totally understandable how these Syrians want to return to their home country and no longer live as refugees outside of Syria. I think many of them are obviously very determined to come back and start doing that really hard work that's going to be required to rebuild Syria. But to get to the point I think you're suggesting here is that there certainly are some risks for Syrians who are returning home. We don't know how the political transition is going to pan out, and there is anxiety about instability and potential future conflict between different groups inside Syria. And it could potentially be a dangerous country in a short period of time. So obviously, you know, as I said, there are some real risks. But at the same time, I think many Syrians are trying to be very optimistic, and they want to work hard to stabilize the country and to build an inclusive political system that will enable Syrians to come home and have a safe country to live in once again.
The Turkish foreign minister, during his visit to Damascus today, has called for sanctions to be lifted and for the international community to engage with the new administration. How much influence does Turkey hold in this new era Syria?
Well, I think it's safe to say that probably of all the foreign countries in the world, Turkey is likely the biggest winner from the fall of Assad. There is no doubt that Turkey has huge stakes in the future of its southern neighbor, and given the role that Ankara played throughout the Syrian civil war, given the fact that Turkey hosted millions of Syrian refugees over the past 14 years, and the fact that Idlib, the governorate from where last month and this month's offensive on the Damascus regime started was basically, for all intents and purposes, a de facto Turkish protectorate. There's no denying that Ankara has played a very special role in the recent events that took place in Syria. Not saying that Turkey was in control of everything that happened. I disagree with the analysts who go that far, but there's no doubt that Turkey has had a very important role in the recent fall of the Assad government. And I think Turkey is very well positioned to capitalize on the ongoing developments in Syria. As we've been talking about, there's so much reconstruction that needs to take place inside Syria, mindful of the experiences and the capacities of Turkish construction companies and the geographic factors. I think probably these Turkish companies will have valuable opportunities when it comes to the redevelopment of Syria in this upcoming period. But there are these issues of sanctions that have to be worked through, and I think it's very understandable why Turkey wants to see the sanctions on post-Assad Syria go away as quickly as possible. That's going to make it much, much easier for different companies from Turkey and from elsewhere to come in and get this process of reconstructing Syria started. If these U.S. and other Western sanctions stay on Syria, that's going to undermine the prospects for the country's reconstruction.
Well, thank you so much for joining us with your insights today. That is Giorgio Cafiero, Middle East Analyst and CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics in Washington, D.C.
Good to be with you.
Let's bring in Aaron Zelin, a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and founder of jihadology.net. Welcome to the program, Aaron. Now, Syrian refugees returning to their homeland and, of course, finding destroyed homes and the mass devastation. What will it take to rebuild Syria?
I think one of the key things will be easing a lot of sanctions that were put on the Assad regime, since obviously the new administration, none of it had to be related to it, so that there could be a ton of investment in the country to rebuild it, since the regime never rebuilt anything after it had originally taken territory back in 2016.
Turkey has echoed those calls for the lifting of sanctions and for the international community to engage with this new administration. How much influence does Turkey hold over this new government?
I think that they're going to view each other as strategic partners going forward, as well as likely Qatar as well. However, HTS, the group that took over the country, and the leader Ahmed al-Sharaa or Abu Muhammad al-Jalani are independent as well. So I think that they'll seek help from anywhere they can get it. And that's one of the reasons why I think that they've been happy that other Western countries have already come to Damascus to meet them, such as the UK, France, Germany, and the United States now.
Speaking of HTS, they have made commitments about protecting Syria's diverse communities. What evidence is there that they will keep this promise?
Well, if you look at the last couple of years of their rule in northwest Syria, the Christian and Druze minorities have been able to live relatively peacefully. Obviously, they're still a minority group, and so it's not 100% perfect. But compared to what it was maybe 10 years ago, they haven't been really harassed, and they've been able to do their own religious services and the like. The bigger question is whether minorities will have political representation, since while they might not have been bothered, they weren't a part of the Syrian Salvation Government either.
And speaking of representation, there were also the multiple armed groups that were involved in this recent change of power. How is this new administration handling these different factions and their interests?
I think that because HTS is the one that started the offensive, took over the country, has been leading the transition, that a lot of people will respect their decision-making and that there will be a honeymoon period in the beginning. So far, we've already seen close ties with the Southern Operations Room in the South, and HTS's governance structures have taken over in the South, as well as commanding the borders with Jordan. And then in the north, we've already seen, more connections happening between HTS and the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army. The bigger question likely will be how the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, which is also a U.S.-backed group, will fit into this picture, since they would prefer some level of autonomy. But HTS has talked about unifying all Syria under one command.
Okay. Aaron Zelin from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. We appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.